Morning, boys and girls. I'm so excited to be starting our studies in the book of Joshua this morning. But what that means is that we are going to have to take a jump back into the Old Testament. So I thought it would be a good idea for us to have a quick summary of what has happened in the first few books of the Bible that get us to the point in Joshua. So you will remember what happened in Genesis chapter 12. In Genesis chapter 12, God made 3 promises to Abraham. You remember? He said, Abraham, you are going to have as many descendants as there are stars in the sky. You are going to live in the promised land, and I will bless you. And throughout the whole Bible, we see God fulfilling that promise to Abraham. And Abraham, at the ripe old age of 100, he gives birth to his miracle baby. Can you remember his name? His name was Isaac. And he then goes on to have twin sons. Who were they? That's right. That was Jacob and Esau. And we know that Esau was the eldest son, and so he was going to inherit the birthright from his father, but that he sold his birthright to Jacob, and that before Isaac dies, Jacob is blessed by his father. Jacob then marries Leah by mistake. You can ask your moms and dads about that one. He had worked for Laban for 7 years in order to marry Rachel, but Laban tricked Jacob, and instead he married Leah. And then he worked another 7 years in order to marry Rachel, and that was who he originally thought he was marrying. And between them, they had 12 sons, who then became known as the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, we all know how the story goes. Joseph, the youngest and favorite, gets sold into slavery. He lands up in Egypt, where he goes through a whole lot. But Genesis tells us that all of it happened so that God could do what he needed to do. Joseph knew that although these things were happening to him by other people, that God was in control. Then, because of Joseph's dreams, he then gets called in and he helps Pharaoh, and he tells him that there is a famine coming. And because of the famine, they are able to save up food. Eventually, the food in Canaan runs out, and Joseph has his brothers coming to Egypt and bowing down to him, begging for food. Joseph, as we know, he forgives them, and then they go home and they fetch their father, and they all move to Egypt. After the famine is over and the years have gone by, Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, he looks around and he realizes, hang on, these Israelites are starting to grow in number. And if a war were to break out, these Israelites have outnumbered us, and there's a possibility that they would win against the Egyptians. And so he then turns them into slaves, and he does everything that he can to decrease their population, in particular the boys, and he goes as far as even killing their firstborn sons. But we know that all along God is there and God is working, and God steps in and he raises up Moses as a leader. Now, do you remember, Moses was a baby boy, and so he should have been killed under Pharaoh's instructions. But God saved him through many miraculous events, and he now is going to use him to rescue Israel from Egypt and take them to the promised land, which is Canaan. Throughout Exodus chapter 1 to 19, it tells us how God rescued the Israelites from Egypt so that he could live with them, dwell with them in the land that he had promised to Abraham. Now, after their rescue, God has rescued them from Israel. Remember, the Lord gathers them at Mount Sinai. And what does he do at Mount Sinai? That's right, he gives them the 10 Commandments. And the 10 Commandments were to teach them how God expected them to live as his people. But we know the Israelites kept turning away. They decided for themselves what God was like, and they made him out to be a golden calf. They refused to trust his promises, even when they could see how good the land was. They rejected God's chosen leaders, and they complained constantly. When Moses tried to take them into the promised land, the people were scared and they didn't trust God's promises. And so God punished them. And do you know what his punishment was? His punishment was that they wandered the desert for 40 years. So Moses and that whole generation never got to enter the promised land. So then Moses died, and that is where Joshua comes in. Joshua then is put in charge, and God tells the Israelites, now this is a new generation of Israelites, he tells them to get ready to enter the promised land, and he tells them to take what he has promised to give them. This generation responded in faith, unlike their ancestors 40 years ago. Boys and girls, this is a really good reminder to us, isn't it? That the right response is always to trust the promises of God, because we know that he is trustworthy. So now at last, the Israelites have again come to the edge of the land of Canaan, and they are ready to inherit the promises that God first made to Abraham. And so that is where we find ourselves today. The previous generation have all died, and God has raised up Joshua to lead his people into the promised land. And Joshua is going to do this by faith and through obedience to God's word. So let's have a look and see how this is all going to work out.